Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. And thank you for the invitation that you have extended to me to share with you today about higher education and emergencies and how we can leverage refugee potential for sustainable livelihoods. As you can see, and as you've already read in the announcement, I'm Barbara MoserMercer, and I am currently visiting professor at the University of Nairobi and coordinating the launch phase of the African Higher Education in Emergencies Network. I'll be sharing the links to that network later on in the slideshow, and you'll be able to contact me with any questions or any suggestions. I will also provide my email address on that same slide at the end of the presentation. Let us begin first by kind of setting the stage. As you can see from the slide, in 2022, up to this point, more than 100 million people have been forced to flee around the world. And you'll probably notice that I'm not necessarily referring to 100 million refugees, because not everyone who is fleeing is automatically a refugee. I will, by definition, use the term people who are forcibly displaced, which is not legally the same as somebody who is a refugee. Of those 100 million people, around 26 million are refugees. And that means they have been recognized by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as refugees. And that recognition is based on a very explicit refugee status determination. And anyone who is applying for that status needs to meet certain criteria. I won't have the time to go into those criteria, but I can refer you to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, and it is there that you can find further details on what is required to be recognized as a refugee. People who are forcibly displaced can also be internally displaced. Not all people who are forcibly displaced are leaving their country. A refugee, by definition, has to have left his or her country. However, there are millions and millions of internally displaced people. And I think one of the most recent examples that you probably have heard about is the Ukraine. There we have a large number of internally displaced persons. Previously, I think one excellent example would have been Somalia, and continues to be Somalia, where we have a large number of internally displaced persons as well. Now, I think what's remarkable about this particular info slide is the fact that the list of countries that have taken in the most refugees might come as a surprise to you. Turkey indeed heads the list. Turkey has taken in millions of refugees over the years, most notably from Syria. Colombia has taken on a large number of refugees. Uganda in Africa is one of the African countries that has taken in the largest number of refugees. Pakistan, and you may have heard of many other refugees who've fled Afghanistan and Iraq and who've landed in Pakistan. Germany is also way up on top of that list, and most recently has taken in a large number of Ukrainian refugees. Sudan, which itself produces a large number of refugees, is also a large refugee hosting country. And most recently, the Tigray conflict has produced a large number of refugees that have landed in some of the refugee camps in East Sudan. The names of some of these camps may not have made it into the press often enough for you to recognize them, but I'll just mention them in passing. It's Tunaidba and Rakuba. Those are two of the larger refugee camps for Tigray refugees. The magnitude of the problem is indeed incredible. Now, what may surprise you, but now that you've seen the list, may no longer surprise you, is that 83% of forcibly displaced persons are hosted in low and middle income countries. 72% are hosted in neighboring countries. And 69% of forcibly displaced persons originated from just 5 countries. So these are some of the figures, and for the purpose of our talk today, I also wanted to mention that of those 100 million people who have been forced to flee, there is an incredibly large percentage of young people, of youth between the ages of 14 to 30, and I think this is one of the age groups that interests us for our presentation today. As I'd already mentioned, many of the refugees and many of the forcibly displaced persons end up either in urban settings or, depending on the policies of neighboring countries, have to live in camps or settlements that are specifically set up for refugees, so-called refugee camps or refugee settlements. However, there's also a fairly large number that we can find in transit on the so-called migration routes. Those migration routes are quite numerous, but for most of the forcibly displaced persons coming from the Middle East or from Iraq, Afghanistan, and also obviously from Africa, most of them end up on the route that ultimately crosses the Mediterranean. So, as we said, most of the refugees, most of the forcibly displaced persons end up not in industrialized countries, but they end up in developing countries. And when we talk about education and higher education in emergencies, the different settings obviously require a different type of approach. And we will go into some of those details later on in the presentation. Let us look at what is the foundation for education in emergencies. I'll first perhaps use the term education in emergencies because that one is better known. Higher education in emergencies is a more recent development, and one that actually only started after the onset of the Syrian crisis. But education emergencies has been a feature of the humanitarian response for quite some time. And since there is very little one can do in disaster relief without there being international instruments and international agreements on which you can base your interventions, I've just listed some of those international instruments and regional agreements and conventions that provide us with a legal foundation, whether in international hard law or international soft law, or in regional law or in national law, that ultimately justify action and intervention in the area of education. UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, has a mandate to actually implement the 1951 Refugee Convention. That is its core mandate. However, over the years, UNHCR has expanded its mandate also to include education. And over the years, its education division has grown. Actually, I should say almost by leaps and bounds. The focus so far has been on making sure that primary and secondary education are being provided to youth that have been forcibly displaced. It was only after 2014, 2015 that there has been more of a focus also on higher education or tertiary education in general. As the problem of forcibly displaced persons around the world has now assumed incredibly large proportions, it is clear that we need a concerted approach. In 2018, the United Nations passed a resolution, the New York Declaration, and out of that New York Declaration grew the Global Compact for Refugees and the Global Compact on Safe and Orderly Migration. Both of these compacts cover migrants, but in one case, persons forcibly displaced, and that is the Global Compact on Refugees. And in the second case, on the Global Compact on a Safe and Orderly Migration, these are not persons who have been forced to flee. These are, among others, economic migrants, climate migrants, etc. They are not, by definition, forcibly displaced. And so these two compacts actually cover, yes, the entire area of migration, but from different points of view. It's unfortunate that they actually ended up with two compacts. It would have been probably, from an advocacy point of view, better to have one compact that covers everyone. But that was not to be. So we have those two compacts, and I will focus mostly on the Global Compact on refugees. So as you can see from the timeline, in 2019, the first Global Refugee Forum was held in Geneva, and the international community was being asked for pledges and to provide funding in order for everyone to chip in on dealing with a global displacement problem. It was no longer going to be the sole responsibility of the United Nations system, but governments, civil society, the private sector of the economy, everyone was being asked to chip in, and that continues to be the case. So in 2023, there will be a second Global Refugee Forum, and as you can see by the timeline, by 2030, there will be the fourth Global Refugee Forum and reporting on what achievements have been made in providing education for forcibly displaced persons. So that is that timeline, and it's within this larger timeline, actually, that higher education emergencies proceeds. I would now like to focus more on the African continent. I will make some references also to the Middle East, because I've worked there for a number of years under a larger Ford Foundation grant in Jordan, in Azraq refugee camp. But much of what I will be discussing this afternoon actually references protracted emergencies. These are emergencies that have lasted for more than a decade, and that, according to a definition by UNHCR, involve more than 25,000 forcibly displaced persons, so larger refugee camps and larger refugee contexts. I think the example that we will use today to explain how higher education in emergencies can be implemented is that of a more recent initiative that focuses on Africa. And that was actually initiated by one donor who threw us the challenge and wanted an African solution to the African problem of lack of access of refugees to tertiary education. And so the African University Network for Higher Education Emergencies was founded. We were going to focus on the entire continent, but during the launch phase, and the launch phase is coming up to an end at the end of December, first 2 years of the network, during the launch phase, we focused on one region in Africa that had the largest, that has the largest number of forcibly displaced persons and refugees, and that is the Horn of Africa. So we've been focusing on the Horn of Africa. We've been focusing, although we have a close collaboration with obviously all of our members, and one of our members is in South Africa. We've been developing pedagogies that were humanizing, as we call them, that were appropriate for the context in which our learners live, and which would actually allow our learners to become independent learners. At the same time, we also understood that the learners that we deal with have been traumatized by experiences that quite often are very, very difficult for us to imagine, but also very difficult to imagine for faculty in African universities. It's not like just because your universities in Africa, everyone knows about refugees and everyone knows what they have gone through. It's sometimes rather surprising to me how little the topic of refugees is actually discussed in Africa. But as is the case with our network, we realized that we did not just need universities in the network. We really wanted to implement the kind of vision that the Global Compact had already initiated, in the sense that it is not just one stakeholder, say a higher education institution, that can tackle the problem on its own. We have to have a whole of society approach. So the African Network for Higher Education Emergencies is a network that brings together higher education institutions, but also non-governmental organizations, NGOs, refugee-led organizations, RLOs, private sector companies, international organizations, in an effort to provide refugees in their own context access to higher education that will ultimately lead to employment. So one of the first things that you may wonder about is, well, how can refugees in the context in which they live access higher education? Is it the faculty that's going to go into a refugee camp? Are the refugees going to be traveling to campus? Neither of the two is actually the correct answer. The first thing that we had to think about was, well, what are those different contexts? The refugee camps, the settlements, the IDP settlements, what do they look like? What does that space look like? And how are refugees going to be able to access those spaces? Because it was clear, given that refugee camps are usually very far removed from any urban setting, they're usually tucked away in a faraway corner of a refugee hosting country. It was clear that in these settings, we either had to build what we call a learning hub, or we had to use existing infrastructure, perhaps from primary schools or secondary schools, or we had to use shelters that would be expanded to accommodate maybe a larger group of students for discussion. And you see examples of all of these in this particular slide. You can see on the upper left-hand corner one of the most advanced learning hubs that I was fortunate enough to help build in Azraq refugee camp with incredible connectivity and what I would consider almost a luxurious infrastructure. Fortunately, we also had the collaboration of Hewlett-Packard, and you can see this was one of the days in which the laptop computers arrived, and all the students were incredibly excited that they could actually work, each one of them with her own laptop. But then as we move clockwise, you can see a primary school classroom that we have reorganized to accommodate a fairly large higher education group of learners. As you move further down, you can see another learning hub that I helped build in Dadaab refugee camp on the border of Somalia. This particular one was actually one of the first designs that I've worked on with a Kenyan developer. This one is not a repurposed shipping container, which was my very first learning hub, built in Kakuma refugee camp. This one in Dadaab was a knockoff on that first model. And it incorporated a number of ingenious design features. You can see from the photo that the foundation is raised. You might be able to discern that there's also a space between the roof top and the end of the walls. Now, both of these design features are important for natural air conditioning. Since you don't have constant electricity, and since air conditioning really is super, super voracious when it comes to energy, and you don't have those power sources in a refugee camp, this was designed to actually mitigate some of the extreme temperatures and the consequences for the learners and for the computer infrastructure inside. So when it gets so hot, usually you have to stop everything between 1 and 4 in the afternoon because that's the hottest time of the day. But with these features where the air can freely circulate, you actually get a bit of a cooling effect that is quite natural and doesn't cost you any extra energy. And then to the very left, bottom left, you can also see how we repurposed a shelter of one of the refugee families that built it out to actually make a cafe. And we used United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees tarpaulins as so-called whiteboards on which refugees would be writing, their dreams or poems or, whatever else they wanted to commemorate onto those so-called walls. So spaces for learning can look very different depending on what the affordances are in a particular context. But what is most important is that despite the fact that we rely almost entirely on digital learning, there has to be a place to meet for the students. They have to be able to come together. They have to be able to learn together. And this is also where the refugee-led organization's role is very important. So refugee-led organizations are organizations of refugees in camp contexts, usually. In our case, those with higher education backgrounds, and they are supporting the learners in the camps because the faculty isn't going there. The university campus doesn't come to camp. It stays in town or wherever else it is located. So we do need to bridge that gap. We cannot just rely on digital communication alone. There has to be an opportunity for students to get together. And I think this is in some way a brief description of the graphic that you see on the lower right-hand side. where we're looking at the space first, and the space actually influences the kind of technology that we're able to use, but it also influences the kind of pedagogical approach that we ultimately go for. And technology does the same. The kind of technology we can use will influence the kind of pedagogical approach that will be usable, and will obviously also depend on the spatial affordances, as you could see them in the different spaces here. Now, we are also, oops, I'm sorry about these slides moving a bit too fast. You might also wonder, well, how do faculty actually interact with the students? So I just talked about the refugee-led organizations who are helping students on the ground, organize discussions, seminar discussions, making sure that these learning hubs are functioning, that refugees can come to the learning hubs. We pay for their transport. We also pay for internet and data bundles. That's all part of what our donors, will accommodate in the budgets that we submit. And here we try and make use of whatever is a low resource technology, meaning whatever is easily accessible and whatever is reliable. It's wonderful to have a lot of educational technology, but most of the educational technology that's on the market today is not usable in low resource environments. And I think the pandemic has provided us with a great deal of confirmation of that. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, ultimately it was the radio that bridged the big gap, because not everyone had access to a device. And without access to a device, you did not have or access to the internet, you did not have access to learning. But the radio came in as the great savior. And so I think it's a very good example of when you go and work in these environments, don't look for the latest innovation in educational technology. Instead, look at what has stood the test of time. Look at what everyone has. And everyone's got a mobile phone. Africa works on mobile phones. Not everyone has a computer, of course, and not everyone has a tablet, although we do provide through our grants, we do provide students with tablets. But the phone is something that everyone has in his or her pocket. And it is via the phone that we make sure that we can communicate regularly. And you can see some of the messages here that we exchange with the students. So when students send their assignments, as you can see here, this is an assignment that they basically uploaded to the learning management system that we're using. And I can download that wherever I am in the world. I can listen to it, and I can then grade it. And I can provide feedback to the students in an asynchronous way, send it back via the learning management system, or even send it back via WhatsApp. So that way I can actually see the students at work. I can get a live recording. It is not the best quality. That's never what we're going to ask for, but it is the real thing. And it's as if I were sitting right next to the students and we're listening to them in real time. Now, let's look a little more at how this pedagogy is being implemented. So what is important for people who've been traumatized, who've been forced to flee? What works and what doesn't work? So one of the things that we found is that these learners learn best by doing. And we can never forget that having lived through the traumatizing experiences that they have lived through, they will never, ever again learn the same way as they used to before they had to flee. So although we're taking regular degrees from African universities and are offering those to refugees, provided that these degrees lead to employment, we have also integrated a big package of what we call social emotional learning. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And the social emotional learning package is required of all students. They don't get academic credit for it, but it's required. And it's 3 months of athletics, and it's 3 months of applied arts, and 3 months of community engineering. And you may be a little bit surprised as to why do we combine sports and the arts and engineering? It's an odd combination, isn't it? Well, if you think of it in terms of what we know about how the brain functions, the sports, athletics really makes sure that these learners are fit, that they are in good physical condition, which obviously also has a big impact on their mental condition. The arts, ubiquitous in Africa. We have so many different expressions of art. So we're tapping into the cultural resources of the refugees and are making sure that they can really display those, that they can work with those resources and express themselves. The engineering is a fairly straightforward solution to what we call, how do you help yourself? For decades, humanitarian innovation consisted in companies in the North inventing something that they thought would be good for refugees. And then once it got installed in those refugee settings, it usually didn't last very long because it was not a solution to a problem that the refugees had. It was a solution that the inventors thought the refugees had. So we want to bypass that. And we really want for refugees to identify the problems that they have in their settings. And we want to give them the tools, the design tools, the design thinking tools, for them to actually produce solutions that work in the context in which they live. And so you can see some of the examples here, starting on the upper left. These refugees were designing, for example, a sensor that was to be installed in a trash truck that was going around in the refugee camp, but never really picking up all the trash. So the problem for the refugees was, how can we get the trash truck to pick up all the trash before it leaves the camp? And by installing the sensor both in the trash truck and in the gate through which the trash truck had to exit, the sensor actually sensed the load that the trash truck was carrying. And if the trash truck wasn't full, the gate wouldn't open. So you can see this is not a problem that any one of us could have thought about unless we lived in that camp. And I think it goes to show that if you give refugee learners the opportunity to design solutions that work in their own context, they can actually improve their own living conditions. And that is what a humanitarian invention should be all about. It should be solving a problem that is a real problem, and it should be sustainable. So on the lower left, just to explain a second example, yes, we gave them some Kinects to work with, and they found another problem in the camp, and that was that children with disabilities were unable to move about in the camp. So they did, but there was no electricity. So they designed this kind of moving vehicle here that was solar powered and would allow refugees with disabilities to move about in the camp and reach the learning hub. I talked a little bit about the social emotional learning bit. and the sports, the athletics, and the arts. I mean, you see some pictures here, but on this slide, you can also see some of the rationale behind it. And it really goes deeply into neuroscience in trying to understand how our brains function best despite adversity. And we all know from research that adversity negatively impacts the plasticity in our brain. And therefore, we've put together this program that we are implementing with different partners. And it's a program that really works at the community level. It doesn't just work on individual students. So students do everything together, and you can see everything is in groups. There's never anyone working on his or her own. And that is absolutely essential. Yes, we want to stimulate self-awareness and self-management, but what's most important in contexts where people have fled conflict is to build relationship skills, to build social awareness, to help them to feel responsible for their communities, to collaborate, and also obviously to be tenacious, to have resilience. So that is, in a nutshell, what we've been trying to do with our program here. Now, let me finish off by talking a little bit about the access to the labor market. We, as an African Higher Education Emergencies Network, have that as a very clear outcome. We do not want to give refugees access to diplomas and degrees that don't have a very, very strong likelihood of leading to employment. Now, there are serious issues with regard to employment. Refugees usually do not have the right to work in the refugee hosting countries where they find themselves in. And even if they have the right to work, quite often the administrative hurdles are such that they will never be able to obtain a work permit. So we're working both on the advocacy side of things, trying to work with the Ministry of Labor, trying to work with the International Labor Organization to implement what is already international law or what is national law, what is enshrined in, for example, the constitution of a country such as Kenya. So we want quality education for refugees. We want, however, for them to be included in the labor market. We want for them to access decent work, as this is the official UN designation for what others might be calling good work or work with good working conditions, etc. So the advocacy for access to the labor market is crucial. The right to work is again enshrined in all these international and international conventions. But as you can see, 70% of refugees live in countries with restricted right to work. And 66% of refugees live in countries with restricted freedom of movement. For example, every time one of our refugee members of the refugee-led organization wants to come down from the refugee camp in Kakuma to Nairobi, they have to apply for a movement pass. They are not allowed to move freely across the country. And then 47% of refugees live in countries with restricted access to bank accounts. Well, if you don't have a bank account, then you can't be paid. And even if you have the right to work, and even if you work, how are you going to get paid? So these are a lot of the issues that we tackle in collaboration, as you can now see the importance of the private sector, the International Labor Organization, national NGOs and international NGOs. I'd like to finish with a slide that hopefully provides some food for thought. I haven't talked very much about women and higher education, but I've tried at least. across the various slides to show you images of refugees where male and female learners are working together. And it almost probably gave you the impression that there are as many girls as there are boys, as many men as there are women. But unfortunately, that is not a true reflection of reality. The figures are absolutely astounding. Only about 3% of refugees have access to higher education. And according to our experience, of those 3%, there is only one female for every 25 male students. So we have a very, very small percentage of women accessing higher education. And you may wonder why. Well, there are cultural reasons, early marriage, patriarchal societies from which these refugees hail. But then there are also chores that usually are reserved for women. And here you can see the long lineup. It's a bi-weekly or monthly event where they line up to get their food rations. And as you can see, there's not a single male in that lineup. It's only the women who go and line up, and it takes them the better part of a day in order to get their rations. On that day, these women cannot come to class. On that day, these women cannot learn. On that day, these women cannot be educated. And there are many, many other chores, like fetching water, taking care of children. All of this is basically a woman's job. So you see the contradiction. You have signs in the camps, such as the ones you see on the right side of the slide, like real men educate their women. Well, that is very aspirational, but it's just not happening yet. And we cannot really see more women in higher education unless more women actually graduate from secondary. And that is, what we call the pipeline on which we now need to focus in order to get women to stay in school, not to get married away, because the family needs money, and the family needs to be fed. These are very complex issues. There is no one simple solution. We have to take a holistic approach, and that's what the network is doing. We're trying to work across society to try and find solutions that work, not just on paper and not just in beautifully bound reports, but that really work on the ground. Other contradictions that you can see in this particular slide are a recommendation as to what is the best composition of your daily diet. Well, food rations have dwindled to about 35 to 40% of what they were a couple of years ago in Kenya, in the Kenyan refugee camps. As you can see, the number of refugees around the world is soaring, and at the same time, food supplies are not keeping up. So the rations have been cut, and that means any aspiration for a balanced diet are obviously not necessarily aspirations that you can work towards immediately. They are often wishful thinking, and it does provide a very stark contrast when you go to the camps and you see those signs and then you see the reality right next to it. So hopefully that will provide you with some food for thought. It's not to discourage anyone, because you cannot be discouraged when you work in those contexts. You need to keep open and hopeful. But you also need to be very much aware of the fact that these are very complex problems that cannot be fixed, with a patent solution. And lastly, we just wanted to also thank those who've been supporting us. Clearly, we cannot do anything without the support of generous donors. And we always want to thank donors who have been listening to us and who believe in the work that we do. And I'm looking forward to any further questions that you might have. My email was on the previous slide. Feel free to email us. Feel free to visit the website of AHEEN and see what we're doing, the research that we're producing, the graduates and what they're doing. I think one always has to look at the brighter side of things, even if the problem seems to be monumental. Even a small solution can bring hope to many people. Thank you very much for your attention.